The judge looked at me and said, "You're here because they want the house?" I nodded. It was my son. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Rosa Martinez, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, the same neighborhood where I raised my family, where every crack in the pavement holds a memory of scraped knees and bicycle lessons. The walls are thin enough that I can hear my neighbor Mrs. Chen practicing piano at 6 in the morning, the sound mixing with the distant rumble of the number 7 train that's been my alarm clock for 40 years. My arthritis makes every morning a small battle. Getting out of bed requires strategy now. First, I test my left hip, then my right knee, feeling for the sharp pains that tell me how my day will unfold. The linoleum floor in my kitchen is cold against my slippers, worn down from decades of standing over the stove, cooking meals that fed a family that once filled this space with laughter. But this particular Sunday morning was different. This was the morning that changed everything. I had set the table for 3. Myself, my son Michael, and my granddaughter Sophia. I'd made his favorite meal, arroz con pollo, the way his grandmother taught me 50 years ago. The smell of saffron and garlic filled my small kitchen, mixing with the scent of fresh bread from the Dominican bakery downstairs. My phone sat silent on the counter. No call, no text, just nothing. I kept checking it, thinking maybe I'd missed something, maybe the sound was off. Maybe my old fingers had accidentally deleted a message. But deep down, I knew. Michael wasn't coming. Again. I picked up a framed photograph from the small table by my window. All of us at Central Park, maybe 15 years ago. Michael was holding Sophia. She couldn't have been more than 5. Ice cream on her face and joy in her eyes. His wife Carmen was laughing at something my late husband had said. Even I looked happy then, my arm around my daughter Elena, all of us squinting in the bright summer sun. The glass was cool under my fingertips. I traced Michael's face in the photo, remembering how proud I'd been of him that day. He'd just gotten promoted at the bank. We thought the world was opening up for our family. I thought my sacrifices were finally paying off. How naive I was. You see, after my husband passed away 10 years ago, everything changed. Not just emotionally, though losing the love of your life after 42 years of marriage is like having half your soul torn away. No, it was financially. That really broke me. Medical bills from his cancer treatment had drained our savings, eaten through our modest investments, consumed the small fortune we'd built over decades of careful planning. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, the same one I still have now, surrounded by bills and insurance forms, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up. The house payments, the property taxes, the utilities. Everything that had seemed manageable with 2 incomes suddenly felt impossible with just my part-time job at the local library. That's when Michael first came to me with his hands out. "Mom, I know things are tight," he'd said, his voice carrying that tone that adult children use when they're about to ask for something they know they shouldn't. "But Carmen's pregnant again, and we really need help with the down payment for the new house. $5,000. That was what he needed. $5,000 that I didn't have, but somehow found anyway. I took out a loan against the house, putting my own home at risk to help my son buy his. I'll pay you back, Mom. With interest. As soon as the promotion comes through." The promotion came through. The money never came back. But that was just the beginning. Over the next 10 years, the requests became routine. $1,000 here for car repairs, $2,000 there for Sophia's private school tuition, $500 for this emergency, $800 for that crisis. Each time, Michael's voice carried the same casual confidence, as if my bank account was an unlimited resource that existed solely for his convenience. "Mom, can you help us out?" Just this once. Just this once became a monthly tradition. I worked 60 hours a week for years, taking on extra shifts at the library, cataloging books until my eyes burned and my back screamed in protest. I cleaned houses on weekends, my knees grinding against bathroom floors as I scrubbed toilets for families who had more money in their couch cushions than I made in a month. All so I could keep saying yes to my children. All so I could keep being the good mother, the reliable safety net, the woman who never let her family down. Do you know what it feels like to be 70 years old and cleaning someone else's toilet because your own son can't manage his finances? Do you know the humiliation of having to explain to your grown child why you can't afford to fix your own broken washing machine because you just sent them money for their vacation? I do. I lived it for a decade. The manipulation was subtle at first. When I'd hesitate about sending money, Michael would bring up Dad's memory. "You know Dad would want us to stick together as a family," he'd say. Or he'd put Sophia on the phone, her sweet voice asking, "Abuela, why can't we come visit anymore?" As if my reluctance to bankroll their lifestyle was somehow preventing family gatherings. Elena, my daughter, wasn't much better. She'd call from her comfortable life in Connecticut, complaining about her mortgage payments while I was eating rice and beans for dinner 3 nights in a row. "Mom, you know we're still paying off student loans," she'd say, as if her master's degree in marketing wasn't providing her with a six-figure salary that dwarfed anything I'd ever made. The house, my house, became the center of every family conversation, not because they cared about where I lived or whether I was comfortable, but because it represented value, equity, money they could access if they played their cards right. I started to notice how they looked at it differently when they visited. Michael would walk through the rooms with calculating eyes, pointing out repairs that needed to be made, improvements that could increase its worth. "You know, Mom, if you updated this kitchen, you could probably add $50,000 to the value," he'd say, as if I had $50,000 lying around for kitchen renovations. Carmen would comment on the neighborhood, how it was up and coming, how property values were rising. She'd show me real estate listings on her phone, pointing out similar houses that had sold for amounts that made my head spin. "Your house could be worth a fortune, Rosa," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. But it wasn't their house. It was mine. The house where I'd brought my babies home from the hospital, where I'd nursed them through fevers and celebrated their birthdays, where my husband had taken his last breath, holding my hand in our bedroom as the morning sun streamed through windows he'd installed himself. It was the only thing I had left that truly belonged to me, yet I began to feel like a tenant in my own home, constantly defending my right to live there, constantly justifying my expenses and my choices to children, who seemed to view me more as a financial resource than a mother. The loneliness was crushing. Birthdays would pass unacknowledged unless I called to remind them. When I caught pneumonia last winter, shivering in my bed with a fever that made me delirious, none of them came to check on me. I found out later that Michael had been in town that same week for a work conference, staying at a hotel just 20 minutes away. 20 minutes. The distance between a mother dying alone and a son who couldn't be bothered to visit. Mrs. Chen, my elderly neighbor who barely spoke English, brought me soup and medicine. A woman who didn't even know my last name showed me more care than my own family. That's when I began to understand how completely I'd been erased from their lives, except when they needed something from me. The discovery that broke something fundamental inside me came on a Tuesday in March. I was going through old papers, trying to organize my finances for tax season, when I found a folder I didn't recognize mixed in with my documents. Inside were real estate listings, market analyses, and correspondence with a real estate agent named Patricia Wells. Michael's name was on everything. My son had been planning to sell my house without telling me. Not just planning, actively working toward it. The papers showed he'd been researching property values, getting estimates, even scheduling inspections. There were emails discussing the best time to approach the situation and strategies for managing family dynamics during the transition. I sat in my kitchen, holding those papers with shaking hands, feeling like I was reading my own death sentence. Because that's what it was, really. Once they sold the house, where would I go? What would I do? I'd have nowhere to live and no money to live on, because every penny I'd saved over the years had been given away to support their dreams. The teacup slipped from my fingers before I realized I was losing control. It shattered against the linoleum floor, pieces of white ceramic scattering like the fragments of my trust. Hot tea spread across the floor, seeping into the cracks I'd never noticed before. I knelt down to clean it up, but my hands were trembling so badly I couldn't pick up the pieces. That's when the tears came. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, body-shaking sobs of betrayal. I cried until my chest hurt, until my eyes were swollen, until I felt completely empty. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to feel truly alone in the world. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring, something I hadn't felt in years. Anger. Pure, clean anger at being treated like a fool, like someone whose feelings and wishes didn't matter. Anger at being seen as nothing more than an obstacle between my children and their inheritance. That night, I did something I'd never done before. I said no. Michael called asking for money to fix his car. Some story about an unexpected repair that insurance wouldn't cover. The usual guilt trip about how he wouldn't ask if he wasn't desperate, how he hated having to come to me, how he'd pay me back as soon as possible. No, I said. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. What do you mean, no? He finally asked. I mean, no, Michael, I can't help you this time. But Mom, you don't understand. I really need... I said no. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. Michael went through every manipulation technique in his arsenal. He reminded me of all the help I'd given him in the past, as if my generosity created some kind of debt that obligated me to continue forever. He brought up Sophia, how this would affect her writing lessons. He even suggested I was being selfish, choosing to hoard money while my family struggled. But for once in my life, I held firm. I'm sorry you're having difficulties, son, but I can't solve them for you anymore. When he realized I wasn't backing down, his tone changed. The pleading voice disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating that I'd never heard from him before. Fine, he said, but don't expect us to keep pretending everything is normal when you're clearly not thinking straight anymore. The implication was clear. If I didn't keep funding their lifestyle, they'd find other ways to get what they wanted, ways that didn't require my cooperation. The next morning, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Legal Aid Society of Queens, a cramped office in a building that smelled like disinfectant and desperation. The lawyer, a kind woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to my neighbor, listened to my story with professional sympathy and growing concern. Mrs. Martinez, she said after I'd finished explaining my situation, what your family is attempting could constitute elder financial abuse. You have rights, and you have options. Options. When was the last time anyone had told me I had options? Sarah explained that I could take legal action to protect my assets, that I could establish boundaries that would be enforced by law if necessary. She helped me understand that saying no to financial manipulation wasn't selfish. It was self-preservation. But she also warned me that family legal battles were emotionally devastating and often permanent. Once you take this step, she said gently, relationships may change in ways you can't anticipate. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought about Michael's voice when he realized I was serious about refusing him. I thought about the real estate papers hidden in my documents. I thought about spending last Christmas alone because none of them could spare time for their mother, while I was sending them money for their holiday celebrations. Yes, I told her. I'm prepared. The legal process was more complicated than I'd expected. Restraining orders against financial coercion, documentation of the pattern of requests and payments, formal notifications that my children were no longer authorized to make decisions about my property or finances. Every form I signed felt like building a wall between myself and my family, but for the first time in years, it was a wall I was choosing to build. Michael's reaction was swift and vicious. Within days of receiving the legal papers, he launched a counterattack that I should have seen coming, but somehow didn't. He began telling people, friends, neighbors, other family members, that I was suffering from dementia, that I was no longer competent to handle my own affairs, that the legal action was evidence of my declining mental state. In our tight-knit Queens community, rumors spread like wildfire. People who had known me for decades began looking at me with pity and suspicion. At the grocery store, conversations would stop when I approached. Former friends would cross the street rather than face the awkwardness of talking to the crazy old lady who was causing family drama. The isolation was worse than anything I'd experienced, even during those first dark months after my husband died. At least then, people had offered sympathy and support. Now I was the problem, the difficult mother who was tearing her family apart over money. But I didn't crumble. Something had changed in me during those long, lonely months of being used and dismissed. I'd found a core of strength I didn't know I possessed. When people whispered about my mental state, I held my head high and continued living my life. When former friends avoided me, I reminded myself that anyone willing to judge me without hearing my side wasn't really a friend worth keeping. The court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late June. I woke up that day with a strange sense of calm, as if the worst was already behind me and this was just a formality to be endured. The family courthouse in Queens is the imposing building with marble floors and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look sick. I sat on a wooden bench outside the hearing room, wearing my best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, the one I'd worn to Sophia's first communion years ago, when I was still welcome at family celebrations. Michael arrived with Carmen and Elena, all of them dressed like they were attending a funeral rather than a legal hearing. They didn't acknowledge my presence, didn't even look in my direction as they huddled together, whispering with their lawyer about strategy and outcomes. When our case was called, we filed into a small room with wood-paneled walls and windows that looked out onto the busy street below. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and tired eyes, reviewed the paperwork while we all sat in tense silence. Finally, she looked up at me over her reading glasses and asked the question that would echo in my mind forever. Mrs. Martinez, you're here because they want the house? I nodded. My voice caught in my throat for a moment before I managed to whisper, Yes, Your Honor. It was my son. The judge's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested this wasn't an unfamiliar situation. She'd probably seen dozens of families torn apart by greed and manipulation, children who viewed their elderly parents as obstacles to inheritance rather than human beings deserving of respect. What followed was the most humiliating hour of my life. Michael's lawyer painted me as a confused old woman whose paranoia and mental decline were causing unnecessary family conflict. They presented a narrative where concerned children were simply trying to help their mother manage finances she could no longer handle responsibly. They twisted every fact to support their story. My refusal to continue providing unlimited financial support became evidence of disorientation. My decision to seek legal counsel was presented as proof that I was being manipulated by strangers who didn't have my best interests at heart. Elena testified about my increasing isolation and erratic behavior, describing phone calls where I'd seemed confused about dates and events. What she didn't mention was that those confused conversations happened when I was exhausted from working double shifts to pay for her children's summer camp. Carmen spoke about her concerns for my safety, living alone in a neighborhood that was changing and becoming less suitable for an elderly woman. She suggested that selling the house and moving me to a nice assisted living facility would be the most caring solution for everyone involved. Through it all, Michael sat quietly, letting others speak for him, maintaining the image of a dutiful son who only wanted what was best for his mother. The performance was masterful. If I hadn't been living the reality behind their lies, I might have believed them myself, but I had my own evidence to present. Sarah Chen had helped me document years of financial requests, going back through bank records and correspondence to show the pattern of manipulation and exploitation. We had the real estate papers I'd discovered, proving that plans to sell my house were already in motion before any concerns about my mental state had been raised. Most importantly, I had my own voice. When the judge asked me to explain my perspective, I spoke clearly and calmly about the decade of financial abuse, the isolation when I couldn't pay their bills, the discovery that my home was being surveyed for sale without my knowledge or consent. Your Honor, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I'm not confused about what's been happening to me. I'm not suffering from dementia or any other condition that prevents me from making rational decisions about my own life. What I am is tired of being treated like a bank account instead of a mother. I raised these children, sacrificed for them, gave them everything I had to give, but I won't let them take the last thing I have left, my dignity and my home. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on the papers in front of her. When I finished speaking, she looked at each member of my family in turn, her expression unreadable. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, she said finally. Mrs. Martinez, you've submitted to psychological evaluation, and the results show no cognitive impairment that would prevent you from making your own financial and legal decisions. The pattern of financial requests from family members, combined with the undisclosed real estate consultation, suggests a concerning dynamic that goes beyond normal family financial support. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. The court finds no grounds to establish guardianship or conservatorship over Mrs. Martinez or her property. The restraining order preventing unauthorized financial transactions will remain in place. It was over. I had won, but victory felt hollow sitting in that cold room, surrounded by the angry faces of my children who had just lost their bid to control my life and assets. Michael stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the small room. He looked directly at me for the first time that day, his face a mask of rage and disappointment that made him look like a stranger. This isn't over, he said quietly, but loudly enough for the judge to hear. Family is family, and blood is thicker than whatever poison these lawyers have been feeding you. The judge's gavel came down hard on her desk. Mr. Martinez, you'll refrain from making threats in my courtroom. This hearing is concluded. But as we filed out of the building and into the humid New York summer air, I knew Michael was right about one thing. This wasn't over. Legal victory was one thing, but the emotional battle for my family's soul was just beginning. The weeks that followed were the loneliest of my life. The whisper campaign about my mental state intensified, fueled by my children's wounded pride and desperate need to justify their behavior to themselves and others. Friends I'd known for decades began avoiding me, unsure of what to believe but unwilling to risk getting involved in family drama. Sunday dinners became a thing of the past. Holiday invitations dried up. My mailbox, once filled with birthday cards and family photos, contained nothing but bills and advertisements. Even Sophia, my beloved granddaughter who had been the bright spot in so many dark days, was kept away from me. I spent most evenings sitting by my window, watching the neighborhood change as summer faded into fall. Young families moved into apartments that older residents could no longer afford. New businesses opened, while familiar ones closed their doors forever. The world was moving forward while I felt suspended in a bubble of isolation and regret. But slowly, something unexpected began to happen. Without the constant stress of managing my children's financial crises, without the exhausting emotional labor of trying to make them happy while being treated with indifference, I started to rediscover who I was beyond being someone's mother, someone's ATM, someone's disappointment. Mrs. Alvarez, my neighbor from across the hall, knocked on my door one October evening with a plate of homemade tamales and a bottle of wine. She was a widow, too, having lost her husband the year before, and she understood the particular loneliness that comes from having your entire identity tied up in relationships that no longer exist or no longer function the way they once did. "Rosa," she said in her melodious voice that still carried traces of her Puerto Rican childhood, "I don't know what's happening with your family, and I don't need to know. But I know you're a good woman, and good women shouldn't eat dinner alone every night." We sat at my small kitchen table, the same one where I'd discovered those real estate papers, and talked until nearly midnight. About our husbands, our children, our dreams deferred and disappointments endured. About getting older in a world that seemed designed to make elderly people invisible. That night was the beginning of my rebirth. Not the dramatic, sudden transformation you see in movies, but a quiet, gradual return to life. Mrs. Alvarez introduced me to other women in our building, other widows and divorcees who had learned to create family from friendship, to build community from shared experience rather than shared blood. We started having regular dinners together, taking turns cooking meals from our different cultural backgrounds. Mrs. Ling taught us to make dumplings. Mrs. Johnson shared her grandmother's cornbread recipe. I contributed my mother's arroz con gandules, the dish I'd been making for 50 years but had rarely been appreciated by my own children. In January, Mrs. Alvarez convinced me to join her at a community center art class for seniors. I protested that I'd never been artistic, that I didn't have any talent for creative pursuits, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. "Talent isn't everything," she said. "Sometimes you just need to put color on paper to remember you're still alive." The instructor, a patient young woman named Sarah who reminded me of Sophia at her sweetest, encouraged us to paint whatever spoke to us. While other students worked on still lifes of fruit bowls and landscapes from magazine pictures, I found myself painting memories. The view from my bedroom window on summer mornings, my husband's hands as he worked in our tiny garden, the faces of my children from the days when they still looked at me with love instead of calculation. It was therapeutic in ways I hadn't expected. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had been lost in decades of serving everyone else's needs. The paintings weren't masterpieces, but they were mine, created for my own pleasure rather than someone else's approval. Spring brought another unexpected development. Sophia showed up at my door on a Saturday afternoon in March, tall and beautiful at 17, but with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen her. "Abuela," she said, using the Spanish endearment she'd abandoned years before. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you." My heart raced as I let her into my apartment, afraid to hope that this was reconciliation rather than another attempt at manipulation. But as she sat on my couch, the same couch where she used to curl up against me during movie nights, I could see that she was genuinely distressed. "I miss you," she said simply, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "I miss coming here and feeling safe. I miss the way you used to listen to me without trying to fix everything or judge me or make it about yourself." The contrast with her father was implicit, but clear. I learned that Michael's financial pressures hadn't decreased since he'd lost access to my money. If anything, they'd gotten worse, and he was taking out his frustrations on his family with increasing frequency. Not physical abuse, but the kind of emotional manipulation and control that I'd endured for years. "Dad says you've lost your mind," Sophia said carefully, "but you seem fine to me. More than fine, actually. You seem happier than I've seen you in years." And she was right. Despite the loneliness, despite the family estrangement, despite the community whispers, I was happier. The constant anxiety about disappointing my children was gone. The guilt about not doing enough, giving enough, being enough had evaporated. For the first time in decades, I was living for myself. Sophia started visiting regularly, sometimes bringing homework to work on at my kitchen table, sometimes just coming to escape the tension at home. I didn't ask about her parents or probe for information about the family dynamics. I just provided what I'd always been good at providing: unconditional love, patient listening, and the kind of safety that comes from being with someone who isn't keeping score. Through Sophia, I learned that my stance had created ripple effects I hadn't anticipated. Elena was struggling with her own financial responsibilities now that she couldn't fall back on Mom's emergency fund. Michael's marriage was strained as Carmen realized that his promises about inheritance money weren't going to materialize anytime soon, but I also learned that my example was inspiring some positive changes. Elena had started attending financial counseling to learn better money management. Carmen had gone back to work part-time, taking some pressure off Michael's income. They were learning to live within their means instead of constantly expanding their lifestyle based on assumed future windfall from their mother's assets. It wasn't the family reconciliation I'd once dreamed of, But it was something healthier than what we'd had before. Relationships based on reality rather than fantasy, on respect rather than exploitation. One evening in late spring, as I was watering the plants that now filled my sunny windows, another small rebellion against the dark isolation of my previous life, I heard a knock at my door. I expected to see Sophia or one of my new friends, but instead found Michael standing in the hallway. He looked older than when I'd seen him in court, grayer and more tired. The confident swagger that had carried him through years of financial manipulation was gone, replaced by something that might have been humility. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we talk?" I let him in, but I didn't offer him a seat or a drink. I'd learned the importance of controlling the environment when dealing with people who had hurt me. "Sophia has been visiting you," he said, stating a fact rather than asking a question. "Yes. She's been talking about how different you are. Happier. More like yourself." I waited, not helping him with whatever speech he'd prepared. "I've been thinking about what happened," he continued, his voice strained with uncharacteristic emotion. "About the legal stuff, the court hearing, all of it. And I think I understand now why you did what you did." It wasn't a full apology, but it was more acknowledgement of wrongdoing than I'd ever gotten from him before. He talked about the pressure he'd been under, the financial mistakes he'd made, the way he'd justified treating me like a solution to his problems, rather than a person with my own needs and limitations. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said finally. "I don't even know if I deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that I see now what I was doing to you. And I'm sorry. Sorry. After all these years, all this pain, all this damage to our relationship. Sorry. It should have felt like more. It should have healed something inside me, or brought back some of the love I'd once felt for this man who had been my baby, my first child, the boy I'd stayed up nights worrying about when he had fever or bad dreams. But it didn't. The apology was too little, too late, too self-serving. He was sorry because his strategy hadn't worked, because he'd lost access to my money, because his family was falling apart, because his daughter was bonding with me instead of respecting his narrative about my mental decline. He wasn't sorry for treating me like less than human for a decade. He was sorry for getting caught. "Thank you for saying that," I told him. "I accept your apology." But I didn't say I forgave him. Forgiveness, I was learning, wasn't something that could be granted just because someone asked for it. It was something that had to be earned through changed behavior over time, and Michael hadn't even begun that process yet. He left that evening disappointed, I think, that his apology hadn't magically restored our relationship to what it had been before. But what he didn't understand was that I didn't want our old relationship back. That relationship had been built on my willingness to be used, and his sense of entitlement to use me. It had been toxic for both of us, though I'd been the only one suffering from the poison. Summer came again, marking a full year since that awful court hearing, since I'd been forced to defend my right to control my own life and property in front of a judge and a room full of strangers. The anniversary should have been painful, but instead I found myself celebrating. I was sitting in my apartment on a Sunday evening, watching the sunset paint the Queen's skyline in shades of gold and pink, when I realized how much my life had changed. The constant anxiety was gone, the dread that had lived in my chest for years, wondering when the next financial crisis would hit, when the next guilt trip would arrive, when I would disappoint my children again. All of that was gone. In its place was something I'd nearly forgotten: peace. My calendar was full now, but with activities I'd chosen for myself. Art class on Tuesdays, dinner with my neighbor friends on Thursdays, Sophia's visits whenever she needed refuge from the ongoing drama at home, volunteer work at the local literacy center where my bilingual skills were actually appreciated rather than taken for granted. I was living on less money than I'd had in years. No more sending hundreds or thousands of dollars to adult children who should have been supporting themselves. But I felt richer than I had in decades. Rich in time, in peace, in relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than one-sided exploitation. The house that had been the center of so much family conflict was still mine, but it no longer defined my worth or my security. I'd learned that I could live happily in a small apartment, surrounded by plants and books and art supplies rather than memories and obligations. I'd even started dating again, something that would have seemed impossible during those dark years when I felt so depleted and worthless. Robert, a gentleman I met in art class whose wife had died 3 years ago, had been taking me to dinner and movies, treating me with the kind of gentle respect I'd forgotten was possible between a man and a woman. "You're not like other women my age," he told me once as we walked through Central Park after a museum visit. "Most of us are so weighed down by family drama and health problems and regrets. But you seem light, free. Yes, that was exactly what I was. Free from the prison of other people's expectations. Free from the burden of trying to buy love with money I couldn't afford to give. free from the exhausting work of managing other adults' emotions and consequences. It had cost me my relationship with my children, at least for now. Elena still wasn't speaking to me, and Michael's interactions were limited to awkward attempts to rebuild a bridge he'd burned beyond recognition. But it had given me back my relationship with myself, and after 73 years of living for other people, that felt like a miracle. Sophia graduated from high school that spring, and she invited both sides of the family to the ceremony. Her parents and their circle of friends on one side, me on the other. It was awkward and tense, but she was determined to have everyone she loved present for her achievement. Watching her walk across that stage in her cap and gown, I felt a pride that was different from what I'd experienced as a mother. This wasn't pride in my child's accomplishment, didn't reflect on my success as a parent, wasn't about me at all. It was pure joy in seeing a young person I cared about reaching a milestone and creating her own future. After the ceremony, Sophia came to me first, before her parents, before her friends, before anyone else. She hugged me tightly and whispered in my ear, "Thank you for showing me that I don't have to accept being treated badly just because someone is family." That's when I knew that all the pain, all the loneliness, all the difficult choices had been worth it. I'd taught my granddaughter something I'd never learned at her age, that love without respect isn't really love at all, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone else's worst behavior. The legal papers that had once seemed so harsh and final were now just documents in a filing cabinet, proof that I'd finally learned to protect myself. The money that had once flowed from my account to my children stayed in my savings, earning interest instead of resentment. The energy I'd once spent managing their crises was channeled into creating art, building friendships, and discovering parts of myself I'd never had time to explore. People in the community who had once whispered about my mental state now saw a woman who was clearly thriving in her independence. The rumors about dementia and family drama faded, replaced by recognition that I'd simply reorganized my priorities in a way that served my own well-being rather than everyone else's convenience. Some evenings, I still looked at that old photograph from Central Park, but the emotions it evoked had changed completely. Instead of grief for what we'd lost, I felt gratitude for what I'd learned. Those people in the picture, including the version of myself who thought her worth was measured by how much she could give others, were like characters in a story I'd once lived, but had now moved beyond. I'd started taking photographs of my new life. Sophia laughing at my kitchen table, my neighbor friends gathered around Mrs. Alvarez's dinner table, my latest painting propped against the easel in my living room, Robert and me feeding ducks in the park. These new images told a different story, one of chosen family, creative expression, and hard-won joy. The woman in these new photographs looked lighter somehow, as if a weight she'd carried for so long had finally been set down. Her smile reached her eyes in a way that hadn't been true for years. She looked like someone who was living her own life, rather than existing as a supporting character in everyone else's story. That transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of small choices, daily decisions to prioritize my own well-being over other people's demands. Learning to say no without guilt took practice. Learning to enjoy my own company took time. Learning that I was worthy of respect even when I couldn't provide financial support took the longest of all. But I had learned it. At 73 years old, I had finally learned that being a good mother didn't mean sacrificing everything for ungrateful children. Being a good person didn't mean accepting mistreatment from people who claimed to love me. Being generous didn't mean being a doormat, and setting boundaries didn't make me selfish. The judge who had asked that pivotal question, "You're here because they want the house?" probably forgot about my case as soon as we left her courtroom. But I would remember her words forever, not because they were profound or particularly wise, but because they forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding for years. My own son was more interested in my property than my well-being. Accepting that truth had been devastating, but it had also been liberating, because once I stopped pretending that our relationship was something other than what it actually was, I could start making decisions based on reality instead of fantasy. The reality was that Michael might never become the son I'd hoped he would be. Elena might never acknowledge the harm she'd caused or contribute to repairing our relationship. My family might remain fractured, divided by money and resentment and pride. But the reality was also that I could create a meaningful life without their approval or participation. I could find joy and purpose and connection outside the narrow confines of biological family. I could build the kind of relationships I'd always wanted but had never demanded from my own children. Relationships based on mutual respect, genuine affection, and equitable give and take. At 73, I was finally learning to live as the protagonist of my own story, rather than a minor character in everyone else's drama. It was scary sometimes, taking responsibility for my own happiness instead of deriving it from other people's success or approval. But it was also exhilarating, like discovering a room in your house that you'd never known existed. As I write this story, sharing with you the most painful and transformative period of my life, I'm sitting in that same apartment in Queens where so much of this drama unfolded. But it feels like a different place now, filled with light and plants and artwork, inhabited by a different woman than the one who once sat here in despair, wondering how her children had become strangers. The walls still have the same cracks. The floors still creak in the same places, but the energy has completely changed. Instead of echoing with loneliness and resentment, the space hums with contentment and possibility. Instead of feeling like a waiting room where I pause between crises, it feels like home. I'm not telling you this story to turn you against your own family or to convince you to cut off relationships that might be salvageable. Every situation is different, and every person has to make their own choices about what they can and cannot accept in their relationships. But I am telling you that it's never too late to start treating yourself with the same consideration you've always shown to others. It's never too late to stop accepting crumbs of affection from people you've given everything to. It's never too late to discover that you are worth more than what you can provide to others. The hardest lesson I've learned in 73 years is that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you will hurt you deeper than strangers ever could. They'll use your love for them as a weapon against you, knowing that your desire to maintain the relationship will keep you accepting treatment you would never tolerate from anyone else. But I've also learned that you don't have to keep accepting that treatment. You don't have to sacrifice your dignity to maintain relationships that exist only at your expense. You don't have to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm, even if those people raised you, even if you raised them, even if you share DNA or history or mutual friends. Love should not cost you your self-respect. Family shouldn't be a source of constant anxiety and financial drain. Being generous doesn't mean being stupid, and being kind doesn't mean being a victim. I wish I'd learned these lessons earlier, when I still had more years ahead of me than behind me. But I'm grateful to have learned them at all, because the alternative was spending whatever time I have left the way I'd spent the previous decade, exhausted, exploited, and invisibly furious at the people I was supposed to love unconditionally. Now when people ask if I regret taking legal action against my children, I tell them the truth. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that our relationships had deteriorated to the point where a judge had to intervene to protect me from my own family. I regret that my children learned to see me as a resource rather than a person. And I regret that I taught them it was acceptable to treat me that way. But I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret choosing my own well-being over their convenience. I don't regret discovering that I could be happy alone rather than miserable in relationships that had become toxic. And I certainly don't regret the life I've built in the aftermath of that decision. It's smaller than the life I once had, with fewer people in it and less drama. But it's entirely my own, shaped by my choices and filled with people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. If you see yourself in any part of this story, if you recognize the patterns of manipulation and exploitation that nearly broke my spirit, I want you to know that you have options. You don't have to keep living as supporting character in other people's stories. You don't have to keep accepting disrespect from people who claim to love you. It's scary to change the dynamics in long-established relationships. It's scary to risk loneliness in order to demand respect. It's scary to stop being the person everyone depends on and start being someone who takes care of her own needs first. But on the other side of that fear is a kind of freedom you may have forgotten was possible. The freedom to wake up in the morning without dreading what crisis you'll be asked to solve, what guilt trip you'll be subjected to, what price you'll be asked to pay for remaining in your family's good graces. The freedom to discover who you are when you're not constantly managing other people's emotions and consequences. The freedom to form relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. The freedom to live as the author of your own story rather than a prop in someone else's production. I'm 73 years old, and I'm just beginning to understand what it means to live authentically. I spent most of my adult life believing that my value was determined by how much I could sacrifice for others, how many problems I could solve, how much pain I could absorb without complaining. Now I know that my value is inherent, not earned. I matter not because of what I can provide to others, but because I am a human being deserving of respect and kindness. My needs are as important as anyone else's, and my happiness is my own responsibility. Not something I should expect others to create for me, but also not something I should sacrifice to create for others. This realization came at a cost. I lost relationships that had defined my identity for decades. I faced community judgment and family rejection. I had to rebuild my entire social world from scratch, learning to form friendships rather than simply serving as everyone's backup plan. But what I gained was infinitely more valuable than what I lost. I gained self-respect, inner peace, and genuine connections with people who value me as I am. I gained creativity, spontaneity, and the luxury of making choices based on my own preferences rather than everyone else's needs. Most importantly, I gained myself, the version of Rosa who existed before she became everyone's solution, everyone's safety net, everyone's disappointment. The woman who had dreams and opinions and preferences, who deserved to take up space in her own life. Have you ever found yourself in a situation like mine? Have you watched your own needs disappear under the weight of everyone else's demands? Have you wondered what happened to the person you used to be before you became everything to everyone except yourself? If so, I want you to know that it's not too late to reclaim your life. It's not too late to start setting boundaries, to start saying no, to start treating yourself with the same compassion you've always extended to others. It won't be easy, and it may not be pretty. The people who have benefited from your self-sacrifice won't appreciate your newfound boundaries. They may accuse you of selfishness, manipulation, mental decline, whatever it takes to restore the dynamic that served their interests. But on the other side of that difficult transition is a life that belongs entirely to you. A life where your time, energy, and resources are allocated according to your own values rather than other people's demands. A life where you matter as much as anyone else, where your well-being is prioritized by the most important person in your world, you. Let me tell you about another discovery I made during these years of transformation. As I became more honest with myself about the toxic dynamics in my family, I started recognizing similar patterns everywhere. At the community center, I met women who had given their entire life savings to adult children who never called except when they needed money. At the grocery store, I overheard elderly people talking about grandchildren who only visited when they needed babysitting or financial help. It wasn't just my story. It was a hidden epidemic of elder abuse disguised as family love, enabled by a culture that tells us parents should sacrifice everything for their children, no matter how old those children are, no matter how capable they are of managing their own lives. I started volunteering with legal aid, helping other elderly people recognize when their generosity was being exploited. I sat in that same cramped office where Sarah Chen had first explained my rights, holding the hands of women who were living the same nightmare I'd escaped. "But he's my son," they would say, tears streaming down their faces. "If I don't help him, who will?" I knew that voice, that guilt, that fear of abandoning someone you loved even when they were destroying you. I'd been there. I'd felt that crushing weight of responsibility for grown adults who had learned to see their mother as an endless resource, rather than a person with her own needs and limitations. "He's your son," I would tell them gently, "but you're also his mother. And a good mother teaches her children to be responsible, independent adults. A good mother doesn't enable behavior that hurts everyone, including him." Some of them listened. Some of them found the courage to say no, to establish boundaries, to demand respect. Others couldn't break free from the chains of guilt and manipulation. I understood both responses. The programming runs deep, this idea that parental love means unlimited sacrifice. But there's a difference between sacrifice and suicide. There's a difference between helping someone through a crisis and becoming their permanent solution to avoid responsibility. There's a difference between generosity and enabling behavior that ultimately harms everyone involved. I learned to explain this difference not just to the women who came to legal aid, but to anyone who would listen. At church groups, at community meetings, at the senior center where I'd started teaching Spanish to other grandmothers who wanted to communicate better with their grandchildren. Love doesn't mean saying yes to everything, I would tell them. Sometimes love means saying no, even when it's hard, even when they get angry, even when they threaten to cut you out of their lives. Because real love wants the other person to grow, to become responsible, to stand on their own feet. The responses were always mixed. Some people nodded in recognition, sharing their own stories of financial manipulation and emotional blackmail. Others looked uncomfortable, unwilling to examine their own family dynamics, or admit that their children might be taking advantage of their love. I understood their resistance. For years, I'd told myself that Michael and Elena were just going through difficult times, that they were grateful for my help even if they didn't express it, that family meant being there for each other no matter what. I'd made excuses for behavior that I would never have tolerated from strangers, friends, or acquaintances. The cognitive dissonance was enormous. How do you reconcile the fact that the children you raised, the people you love more than your own life, are treating you worse than they would treat casual acquaintances? How do you accept that your own flesh and blood sees you primarily as a resource to be exploited, rather than a person to be cherished? It's easier to blame yourself. To think that if you were a better mother, if you had more money, if you were more understanding, if you asked for less, somehow the relationship would improve. The alternative, accepting that you're in a fundamentally unhealthy dynamic with people you can't stop loving, is almost unbearable. But living in denial is worse than facing the truth. Denial keeps you trapped in patterns that eat away at your soul, year after year, until you barely recognize yourself anymore. Truth gives you options. Truth gives you power. Truth allows you to make conscious choices instead of just reacting to whatever crisis someone else brings to your door. The truth was that my children had learned to use my love against me. They knew exactly which buttons to push to make me feel guilty, obligated, responsible for their choices and consequences. They'd perfected a system where their problems became my emergencies, where their poor decisions became my financial responsibility. And I had taught them this system by never saying no, by always finding a way to help, by accepting the premise that their needs were more important than my own well-being. My generosity had become enabling. My love had become a weapon they used against me. Breaking this cycle wasn't just about protecting my money or my property. It was about saving my sanity, reclaiming my dignity, and teaching them, even at their age, that relationships have to be reciprocal to be healthy. Did they learn the lesson? Michael seemed to understand some of it, at least intellectually. His apology, while inadequate, showed some recognition that his behavior had been harmful. He'd started therapy, according to Sophia, working on whatever issues had led him to see his mother as a solution to his problems, rather than a person deserving respect. Elena remained more resistant to the idea that she'd done anything wrong. In her mind, she was still the victim of an unreasonable mother who had chosen lawyers over family, money over love. She couldn't or wouldn't see that I'd been forced into legal action by their refusal to respect my boundaries, their determination to take control of my assets whether I wanted them to or not. But their reactions, ultimately, weren't my responsibility. I couldn't control whether they learned from this experience, whether they grew as people, whether they ever truly understood the damage they'd caused. My job was to protect myself, to create a healthy environment for whatever relationships might be possible in the future, and to live my own life with dignity and joy. And that's exactly what I was doing. 3 years after that court hearing, life had settled into a rhythm that felt both peaceful and purposeful. My mornings began with coffee and painting, watching the sun rise over Queens while I worked on whatever image was speaking to me that day. My afternoons might include volunteer work, lunch with friends, or time with Sophia, who was now in college but still made it a point to visit regularly. My evenings belonged to me, reading books I'd never had time for, watching movies that interested me, having dinner with Robert or my neighbor friends, or simply sitting quietly with my thoughts and my gratitude for this second chapter of life that I'd never expected to have. The financial pressure was gone. Without the constant drain of Michael and Elena's requests, my savings were growing instead of shrinking. I wasn't wealthy, but I was secure in a way I hadn't been since my husband died. I could afford small luxuries, art supplies, restaurant meals with friends, gifts for Sophia that came from love rather than obligation. More importantly, the emotional pressure was gone. The anxiety that had lived in my chest for years, the constant hypervigilance about my children's moods and needs and crises, had dissipated. I no longer felt responsible for managing other adults' lives, solving other people's problems, or sacrificing my own well-being to maintain relationships that brought me no joy. The grief had faded too, though it had taken longer than I expected. For years I mourned the mother I'd failed to be, the children I'd lost, the family that existed only in old photographs and fading memories. But eventually I realized that what I was grieving had never really existed in the first place. The perfect family I'd imagined, where my sacrifices were appreciated and my love was returned, had been a fantasy I'd constructed to make sense of a reality that was much more complicated and much less fair. The real Michael and Elena were adults who had learned to prioritize their own comfort over their mother's well-being. The real relationship we'd had was based on my giving and their taking, with very little genuine connection or mutual respect. Mourning the loss of that dynamic was like mourning the end of a disease, painful because it had been so much a part of my life, but ultimately necessary for healing. What I had now was better. Honest relationships with people who saw me as a whole person, rather than just a source of support. Genuine friendships based on shared interests and mutual care. A romantic relationship with someone who treated me as an equal partner, rather than a provider of services. I had myself back. The Rosa who had existed before she became a wife and mother, before she learned to define her worth by how much she could give to others. The woman who had opinions and preferences, who could be spontaneous and silly, who deserved to take up space in the world just because she was. This Rosa was still a mother and grandmother, but those weren't her only identities. She was also an artist, a volunteer, a friend, a student in the continuing education classes she'd started taking at the local college. She was bilingual and bicultural, with stories spanning decades and 2 countries, wisdom earned through experience and loss, and ultimately, triumph. She was 73 years old, living alone in a small apartment in Queens, but she was no longer lonely. She had created a life rich with meaning and connection, built on her own terms rather than shaped by other people's demands. The house that had once been the center of so much family drama was still hers, rented now to a young family who reminded her of herself and her husband 40 years ago. The income supplemented her modest pension and savings, providing the financial security that allowed her to be generous by choice rather than obligation. When Sophia brought friends to meet her, they were always surprised by her energy, her contentment, her obvious joy in life. "Your grandmother is so cool," they would tell Sophia. "She seems so free, so happy, like she's figured out some secret the rest of us don't know." The secret wasn't complicated, but it had taken me 7 decades to learn it. You can't control other people's behavior, but you can control your response to it. You can't make someone love you the way you want to be loved, but you can refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your sense of self-worth. You can't change the past, but you can choose how to spend whatever time you have left. I chose joy. I chose peace. I chose relationships that nourished rather than drained me. I chose to believe in my own worth independent of what I could provide to others. These weren't easy choices, and they came at a cost. But every morning when I woke up without that knot of anxiety in my stomach, every evening when I fell asleep feeling grateful instead of resentful, every moment when I made decisions based on my own needs and desires instead of someone else's demands, I knew the cost had been worth it. The woman in the mirror was older now, with more gray in her hair and more lines around her eyes. But she looked lighter somehow, as if she'd finally set down a burden she'd been carrying for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. She looked like someone who had learned to love herself as much as she'd always loved others. Someone who had discovered that self-respect wasn't selfish, boundaries weren't cruel, and saying no to some people was the only way to say yes to your own life. That woman was me. 73 years old, living in Queens, painting watercolors in the morning light and sharing her story with anyone who needed to hear it. A woman who had finally learned that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about mutual respect and genuine care. A woman who had discovered that it's never too late to start living for yourself, never too late to demand the treatment you deserve, and never too late to write a new chapter in your own story. Tell me, have you ever lived something similar to what I just shared with you? Have you known someone who went through this kind of family betrayal and transformation? Have you ever felt like you were giving everything to people who took your love for granted, who saw you more as a resource than as a person deserving of respect and care? Your story matters. Your experience has value. Whether you're just beginning to recognize toxic patterns in your own relationships, or whether you've already taken the difficult steps to protect yourself and reclaim your life, you're not alone in this journey. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me about your own struggles with family dynamics, financial manipulation, or the challenge of learning to prioritize your own well-being. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, the permission they need to start making changes in their own life. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of your own worth or gave you courage to examine the relationships in your life more honestly, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. When you like and subscribe, you're not just engaging with content, you're helping to spread a message that someone desperately needs to hear. There are Rosa Martinez's everywhere, in every community, in every culture. Elderly parents who have given everything to adult children who take their generosity for granted. Mothers and fathers who have learned to measure their worth by how much they can sacrifice, how many problems they can solve, how much pain they can absorb without complaining. But there are also success stories. People who have found the courage to break toxic cycles, to demand respect, to create new definitions of love and family based on mutual care rather than one-sided exploitation. Every time someone shares their story, every time someone admits that love doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, we create space for others to make similar choices. Together, we can remind each other that it's never too late to start living authentically. Never too late to recognize your own value. Never too late to understand that real love, whether from family, friends, or romantic partners, should add to your life, not subtract from it. Never too late to discover that you matter, not because of what you can provide to others, but simply because you exist. You are worthy of respect, kindness, and care, regardless of how much money you have, how many problems you can solve, or how much you're willing to sacrifice for people who may never appreciate your generosity. This is the message I want to leave with you today. This is the truth it took me 73 years to learn. Your life belongs to you. Your happiness is important. Your needs matter as much as anyone else's. And if the people in your life can't accept that basic truth, if they can only love you when you're giving them something they want, then maybe it's time to ask yourself what kind of love that really is. Maybe it's time to start believing that you deserve better, because you do.